Well, I am very excited to be here today with Andy Gill. Thank you so much, Andy, for being with us today. And I wanted to talk to you. You are, of course, touring right now in support of your latest album, which is What Happens Next. The album just dropped about a month ago or so. What's been the reaction to fans as you're out, debuting some of this new material?
Well, the audience has been fantastic. It's gone down, extremely well. I mean, live, obviously, it's a mixture of mid-term stuff, very old stuff from Entertainment, and then some of the new ones from this record. So it's a real kind of look at the whole thing from 1979 onwards.
Yeah.
So.
Very cool, very cool. Well, speaking of the 70s, of course, Gang of Four formed in 1977, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about kind of the climate in Britain at the time. We've interviewed a lot of folks, Steve Diggle from the Buzzcocks, a lot of folks from the kind of classic punk rock era in Britain, and 77 was such a crucial year for so many bands forming. A lot of people got inspired by seeing the Sex Pistols or the Ramones. For you guys back in the day, I mean, what was the catalyst that sparked the creation of Gang of Four?
Well, there's a couple of things really. I think it wasn't those bands, the Sex Pistols, Clash, and so on. It wasn't that. I think what they did was kind of blow everything up and make everything possible. Because the record companies and the way the whole music business worked prior to that was quite staid and had quite conservative kind of ways of going about things. And I think the punk rock thing, I mean, musically it wasn't particularly interesting, but there was characters like Malcolm McLaren who did this old music business thing,
Kind of tried to commercialize or capitalize on it in essence, right?
Yeah, and also be satirical about it. And I think there was a sort of catalyst for John King and I went to New York in '76 and slept on the couches round at Mary Harron's house. Mary Harron is more known now for directing a film called I Shot Andy Warhol and American Psycho. But back then she was a journalist and a writer for both for English papers and for New York music papers and stuff. So she was a brilliant guide for us. So we were in '76 New York, so she'd be taking us down to CBGB's, and you sort of standing at the bar, you'd be sort of having a drink with Joey Ramone, John Cale, and you thought, God, this is quite extraordinary. And if they can do it, then we can do it. And it was that kind of, and Patti Smith's band, J.D. Doherty, the drummer, and and
Blondie, the Talking Heads,
sort of, and television, some on television, and it was that, it's that kind of thing. Like, these are interesting ideas, and they're talking about interesting ideas, and they're having fun while they're doing it, and they're approachable, and this is something that we can do. So that was, to a certain extent, a catalyst. Yeah. I mean, musically, I think there's the fantastic band Dr. Feelgood with Wilco Johnson. Who was, I think, an inspiration. I mean, that's from the early to mid 70s, before punk rock kind of. And the thing that they had was that thing of being very efficient and robotic, and sort of embracing the artifice of being in a band. So there's no kind of pretense of being natural. It's like a sort of
very syncopated and I guess maybe is the term angular sort of
angular and slightly aggressive, and took the audience on rather than just staring at their feet, And I think musically they were quite an inspiration. But the thing that I wanted to do was to have grooves and funk. It felt like having to build a new language from scratch, because nobody was really doing that. Using the guitar in a it's like a noise generating machine, and then combining that with kind of grooves and rhythm, and that was what Gang of Four I think has always been about, musically. Yeah.
Definitely, and so unique at the time. I mean, that style wasn't necessarily always embraced. The incorporating elements of dub, funk, sort of danceability into a somewhat sort of political narrative. I mean, that was really unique back then. Were there times when, amongst other contemporary bands, that you guys felt that you weren't maybe being acknowledged because that style was so left of field relative to what other people were doing back then?
Yeah, I mean, I think nowadays everybody looks back at sort of the first couple of albums, classics. At the time, there were people who were very, very, very into it, and there were other people that were confused by it and didn't like it at all. It wasn't this kind of unanimous like, oh yeah, great, fantastic record. It was like some people really, really got it, and actually we found in America people got it more than they did anywhere else, which is an interesting thing, and I kind of often wonder about that.
Well, you had here in America, of course, you had the funk, the disco. However, at times derided that was as an art form. I mean, maybe a little bit more sensibilities towards danceable music, perhaps upbeat or.
Yeah, that could be. And I think the sort of the liking for groove, is maybe more American than it is British, possibly. I don't know. But also, most of the bands that I grew up listening to, a lot of them were American. A lot of them were American artists, whether it was James Brown or Jimi Hendrix or the Stax records. I think that sometimes, you mentioned the idea of Gang of Four being political, and somehow in some way it's almost as if we're kind of ended up being political by default in a way, in the sense that if you kind of abandon the normal traditional things that rock music goes on about, cars and girls and whatever, if that's not in part of your agenda, and you attempt to kind of think about other real aspects of our lives, and how they work, how they fit together, and all those things, it's almost like you end up being political because you are realistically describing what is our lives are like and what's around us. And I think, it's like
political by default, not with intentionality, perhaps.
There's no intention to be political, but I think by describing things accurately, or we would say accurately, and describing areas which often aren't talked about, I think it becomes a sort of default thing. And I think what you're saying about sort of various Marxist writers, I think definitely there's an influence there of in ways that you look at things.
Kind of the materialist view of inequality and stratification and things like that. Yeah. Well, Andy, I wanted to kind of ask you, looking back, through the years of other bands, other artists that you've had the pleasure of being on stage with, or having them open for you, or vice versa. I mean, what are some memories that stand out of other sort of musicians that you've collaborated with that, looking back over the decades, that you have really pleasant memories of getting to play with?
We played for years with REM.
Michael Stipe, of course, crediting you and the band as a huge influence, but particularly your guitar style.
Yeah. No, he's very. Michael's very honest about these things, and I mean, that they were a great bunch of guys, and they supported us for years, and then they suddenly went enormous.
And REM, of course, considered one of the classic golden era college rock bands, along with the Replacements, and so for us here in the States, they really represented something, particularly in their early years, formative years.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think that they were really strong. And then, obviously the Chili Peppers was a band that were very influenced by Gang of Four.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you of course produced their first album.
Yes, they were quite wild back then. They
Yeah.
probably calmed down a bit.
I was going to ask you, I mean, here we are 30 plus years, 35 years, and I actually listened to their first album a while back. Back then, when you were producing that first album with these, what at the time were a bunch of kids, basically. No offense, not to minimize their artistry, but now here we are, 30 plus years. I mean, did you see back then any glimmer or seed? Did you envision that those seeds that were being planted may come to fruition and they'd still be around after all these years, or with the Chili Peppers? Or did they strike you as a young, hot band that might just burn out, and not last too long?
And I certainly didn't anticipate them sort of getting to the point they did. This kind of giant stadium monster. I think one of my main contributions to that record was the Chili Peppers were. They had a couple of things going on. One was they had these very fast, very short, sort of surf punk things that they did, that were just as fast as they could possibly go. And then the other thing they had were these kind of mid-tempo, groove, hip-hoppy sounding things, which struck me as much more interesting, And we had lots of arguments during the making of that record.
Oh, really?
But yeah.
Different creative sort of ideas of where things should go?
Yeah, I mean, there was a very funny one that was I was trying to get them to use a drum machine to basically as a metronome, so for timekeeping, and Anthony just wouldn't have it and his main problem was it's got no soul. It's a machine.
It's too mechanical. Yeah.
This is 1984, meaning. I don't know. There's some kind of inhumanity is taking over, or
some Orwellian resistance to the machine. Yeah,
to the machine. Gotcha. Although the funny thing was, it was 1984. So we had lots of sort of discussions like that, which are kind of funny. But
it's interesting to think back of what the Andy Gill, more heavy Andy Gill influence would have sounded like, maybe we'll see a remaster here in a couple years with Andy Gill's remix of what the first album might have, in a perfect world, sounded like.
Yeah. No, indeed.
So again, we just talked about your impressive resume of production. You've produced a lot of artists' albums, The Stranglers, Killing Joke, an artist that I absolutely love. What is it about production that, does production allow you to kind of express your artistry in ways that you don't as an actual performer? Is there something about it that you enjoy, being able to actually support other artists and help shape their sound?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I enjoy being in the studio and helping do that exactly. Helping form sounds, helping find ideas, helping things that maybe the artist may not have thought of, and I mean the studio is kind of like an instrument in itself. It's sort of and it's formed of many parts, and there's so many different things which are involved. I mean, in terms of like working with people and getting the best out of them, and but also technical things. Yeah. So it's a weird multi-discipline kind of environment. But I also enjoy it because I also learn things from it. It's working with other people and seeing their way of going about things. And because everybody's a bit different, and it's I've learned a lot from the other artists that I work with.
Andy, a lot of times nowadays, a lot of folks are talking about kind of the democratization of production. About kids in their bedrooms on an iMac with Pro Tools can belt out some, admittedly synthetic. You talked about drum machines earlier, but some sort of maybe 1984 sounds, as we just talked about. And do you think that there's traditional production, getting into a studio, paying for time, can be daunting? I mean, do you think there's a certain element that's positive about the technology and how more artists are able to produce content without maybe more of a traditional studio approach to musicianship?
Yeah. I think it's generally speaking healthy. It's like I totally embraced computers when they came along as a sort of a music making aid. In the 80s, got Apple Macs and did samplers and stuff, and started using them and found ways to work them into, like many people did. But it wasn't something to be afraid of or to be worried about. I mean, there was a weird time in the late 80s when in London people stopped bothering to have live areas for recording, and a lot of people thought the future nobody would bother with live recording. There'd be a vocal booth, but drum machines would take over. There was generally this thought, and people ripped out their live areas and made more control rooms. Which hasn't been the way it's gone, because although many studios have closed, but that's more to do with the economics of the music industry. But
All right. Well, very cool. Well, Andy, we wish you all the best on your current tour, and it was a real pleasure talking to such a musical pioneer such as yourself. So thanks so much for your time.